Oui.
Hello, everyone. This is Let's Discuss a Paper soon after reading it. And what we do is actually reading a paper within 2 hours and then meet here on the Zoom meeting and discuss it right away and try to understand it, discuss our questions and impressions. So I will be leading or chairing this discussion today, and I will be summarizing the paper. But first, let us introduce ourselves. Yota, please.
Hi, my name is Yota Koshima. I'm a research assistant at ATR at Monash University.
Thank you. And Ryochi?
Hi, I'm Ryochi Watanabe at Kyoto University and a PhD student.
Thank you. And I'm Aniko Kustor. I'm a PhD student at Monash University. So today's paper is titled Putting the Mental Back in Mental Disorders, a perspective from research on fear and anxiety. So this paper was written by Vincent, that's a long name, Taschereau Dumochel, Matthias Michel, Hakwan Lau, Stefan Hoffman, and Joseph Ledoux. And it was published in Molecular Psychiatry. It was published very recently. And yeah, so I really like this paper. This was a very interesting paper. Basically, they set out to discuss and kind of put our current understanding of psychiatric disorders in a historical and like just in a general context, and also argue for the importance of subjective experience. So the thesis is that basically subjective experience has been considered as an important factor within psychiatry and within understanding what different psychiatric disorders are or function. However, based on a myriad of historical and other kind of influences, the role of subjective experience has been kind of reduced in a way. And it seems that there's an overall representation of the medical perspective. And because of this, most of the research or much of the research is focusing on either behaviors, or physiological measures, neural circuits, heart rate, etc., things that can be objectively measurable. And in a way, this kind of influences also how like psychotherapists treat people and what kind of tools they have available. Because if the tools are kind of evaluated based on these objective measures like behavior, but not on the subjective experience of the patient, then it is not surprising that there might be a discordance. So specifically, the paper uses the kind of the example, and they kind of argue for this change in the perspective with the example of fear and anxiety. And they go through to the historic, again, context of how fear and anxiety has been studied during the 20th century, and what was the psychiatric and researcher kind of like their attitude towards it, and how we ended up having this kind of the most significant or a highly relevant or accepted system currently of fear is this three systems model, which actually separates well, it says that fear is constructed of like 3 systems or levels or domains. We have the subjective experience or self-reports. Then we have behavior, which would be reflecting, so which would be like an example would be avoidance behavior. And then we would have physiological responses such as elevated heart rate or freezing. No, it's actually freezing the small behavior. So elevated heart rate and like skin conductance changes. So interestingly, if we accept that all these 3 systems or these 3 domains of fear, they are talking about the same construct, the same phenomena, then we would expect that there is a strong correlation and correspondence between the different phenomena, like temporally and in just general. However, the authors point out 2 different levels of disagreement. So they talk about discordance, which is kind of it describes situations or examples when 1 or 2 of these 3 systems are actually not reacting the way how we would assume. So for example, when we have a physiological response, we see elevated heart rate. However, the subjective experience doesn't seem to be corresponding to that. Another somewhat different example or somewhat different way of these 3 systems being in disagreement is the desynchrony, which basically describes when these 3 systems, these 3 variables, are not reacting at the same time. Or that is how I kind of understood it. And so these 2, desynchrony and discordance, these phenomena basically suggest that there might be a general issue in construct validity of our understanding of fear. Which means that whether what we say fear is it reliable or is it acceptable to measure mostly with behavioral measures when they seem to be in discordance and in dysynchrony with the subjective experience. And the authors argue that no, actually we should also or mostly prioritize subjective experience and subjective reports. And they also bring up the higher order thought theory of consciousness as a way or as an example of when a theory of consciousness is able to kind of build upon the subjective experience and also emphasize it sufficiently next to the behavioral and the physiological responses. And yeah, basically the authors argue for a change, a paradigm shift, a change in our research practices and the therapeutic approaches, and argue for the importance and validity of self-reports, both in fear research and also in other psychiatric conditions. And yeah, I think this is how I would summarize this paper. Do you guys have anything to add? Nothing. Okay. Well, then let's go to questions and discussion. So what were your thoughts on this paper?
So basically, I agree with the author's claim. So it's very important. I understand that it's very important to, focus on the subjective experiences than before. I also understand that they introduced a higher order theory model to explain the discrepancy, discordance and dyssynchrony. And one way to, investigate these discordance and dyssynchrony can be use some higher order theoretic method and see whether the re-representation of some area and also seeing the contrast between the comparison between the higher order and lower order representations. I understand that, but I am curious about what cause such kind of differences. For example, in the case of discordance, in this paper, the authors mentioned a case where the subject report really strong fear, but physiological evidence does not support their self-report. So in this case, I think something happening weird in the higher order representations, right?
Well,
no?
Well, I think this is actually the point of the paper, kind of, is that by assuming that the physiological response is the right one, or that's a more truer representation compared to the subjective experience, we are actually kind of doing a disservice to subjective experience. But I mean, I'm not sure actually if you meant this comment that way.
So I think, yeah, this point, when they say construct, I'm a bit, curious what they mean by that. It's kind of vague concept, right? They say that these three components, self-report, behavioral response, and physiological response, has kind of the same source or fear circuit or something. So does it mean that we should investigate some, neural circuits for each aspect, or
Yeah, so I think it is difficult because they might use the term construct validity because of its kind of use in psychology and psychometric research. So it is quite common to, for example, talk about the construct validity of a questionnaire, or basically any kind of measure that's supposed to measure something, and whether it is indeed measuring that one thing that we are talking about. So yeah, it is definitely a bit of a vague description. And yeah, I think that's a good point, whether so in a way fear is a good example, because we have these very clear behavioral and neural and physiological and subjective experience characteristics. But I wonder when it comes to other emotions or other experiences, where it might be not that easy to define these different facets. Yeah, like how would you assess, or how would you decide whether something is a construct or something is one thing?
So the way I understand that is that, when they mention physiological response, it means some low-level representations. And usually that kind of region can be, found by showing some fear, scary stimulus or something. And then I think they mentioned that, or what they mean by, so the reason why they introduced higher order theories that usually, or in the previous study, they tend to focus on that kind of low-level, processing regions to investigate fear experience. But their point is that in order to understand the subjective experience, we need to consider other regions which corresponds to the higher order representation. So it still can be included in like physiological responses, but their suggestion is that we need to, see a much broader regions of the brain, not only focusing on fear regions. This is just my understanding.
Yeah. I remember that they were also discussing the potential differential role of the amygdala and then also the prefrontal regions. So like amygdala would be more responsible to the physiological responses, and then prefrontal regions would be perhaps more responsible to the like the subjective experience of fear in this way. And then both of these areas would be important to examine.
So if that's the case, my question was like, again, when subject experience some strong fear experiences, while their physiological response just a normal, as healthy subject, it suggests that something happening in the higher order area. And if so, my question is that it can affect not only fear experience, but also other, experiences, not limited to emotions, but also visual perception or audition or whatever. So I'm curious whether, that kind of, because, if I remember correctly, like a psychiatric disorder comes with different, disorders, or the different disorder experiences. So can be explained in this framework or not. So what's the expectation if something happening in the higher order? That's my question.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and I actually don't know what would be a good explanation, or what would be the theoretical implication to that and to the concept of fear. But they do mention that for future studies, they suggest to kind of focus on this, on the discordance and the desynchrony between the self-reports versus the physiological response, and also on the neural levels. And then they also already had done some work on this. So perhaps this is something that future papers will discuss. Yeah,
but that was my question or comment on this paper.
So as I said, that so according to hot theory, the visual representation, visual consciousness is also changeable, and in this study also the emotion is also changeable. So you said that how to other how to extend the hot theory, right? What do you want to say?
Oh, my comment was that this paper only talking about fear.
Yeah.
And if something happening in higher order areas,
Yeah.
in the case of disorder in fear, it should also cause some, disorder in other modalities or other experiences. Because the higher order representation, such kind of region should also, do similar jobs for other modality, vision, audition, or whatever. So my expectation was that if something happening in higher order, then it should affect not only fear, but also other modalities, including emotions. That was my, comment.
I see. So basically, the metacognition or something. And I think, so basically, the hot theory focused on metacognition and the prefrontal cortex, right?
Or
so meta-representation or something. So fear, meta-representation of fear is effective. So the subjective fear is changeable. So you said if the hot theory or if the metacognitive representation or metacognitive cognition of what is important. So not only the fear, but also the other modalities will also will be happen. This something is a disorder, right?
Or if I rephrase my comment, is it possible that if something happening in the higher order representation, is it possible that only fear, the higher order representation of fear,
so
has
domain
some problem,
specific,
but not other modalities? Is that possible?
Right.
And my expectation is that it will not, and it will cause some, effects on other modalities. That my.
I see. So how about the alexithymia or something? It's also physiological activities also happen, but their subjective emotion is disappear. So it's so I think related to this situation. So not only fear, but also the other information and emotion also disappear. So I think it is possible to happen. What you say, I think.
Yeah, and I agree with you.
Yeah, but I think it's also possible that maybe not all kind of subjective experiences or emotions are affected to the same degree, just based on like if a specific region in the prefrontal cortex is somehow has somewhat different connectivity with, for example, regions that are associated with fear versus regions with that are associated with, I don't know, anger or yeah. I'm actually, so this is the other thing. It's difficult to pinpoint other specific regions for other emotions for me, because I am not very knowledgeable or not enough knowledgeable, but I also think that it's like fear is very emblematic, like the amygdala, that's like a very well-known brain circuit for a certain emotion, and now I'm thinking like, yeah, with other kind of emotions like sadness or calmness or something like this, what would be yeah, the physiological like brain region, or the brain region that is responsible for the physiological response.
Another comment is about the self-report or the difficulty of self-report. Because let's say if you go to a hospital and you have some problem, not only for fear experience, but also some pain, it's a little bit difficult to explain your, how you feel. Or some, maybe your doctor asks whether it's like a itchy or stung by a needle or something. But without experiencing, such kind of experiences suggested by or mentioned by a doctor, it's really difficult to explain your feelings. So I think that's something we also need to care about. And I think in order to get like a proper description of your feeling, there are many some procedures suggested. I think some of them are listed in this paper, I guess. So some questionnaire, set of questionnaires to assess, and that's also, or improvement of that questionnaire is also important, I feel.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think it's like, I think that's a very good point, that we should trust, or it's perhaps important to trust self-reports and the subjective experience. But then, and I appreciate the authors mentioning that maybe this whole idea about self-reports being untrustworthy is not that well kind of based in evidence, especially when it comes to experiences like emotional experiences. But I also think that it is quite difficult to think of good descriptions or good kind of, like, I think even just naturally in naive conversations, you would talk about your bodily response when you were when you are talking about, for example, your fear, like, oh, I was so scared I couldn't move, and yeah, in that way it's difficult for me to think of purely kind of experience-based descriptions of, for example, fear. But yeah, I also think that it's actually like there are a lot of different psychiatric disorders and a lot of different topics where we should pay attention more to the subjective experience. And for me, like, I am very much biased about this, but for me, because as you know, I'm interested in depersonalization and derealization, like those are typically, a very, very kind of idiosyncratic subjective experience, and they haven't been studied that much because it is more unclear, like what it would be the physiological response, or but like how to identify physiological or behavioral correlates for those. And so I think it's, at least for me, in one way, I think it is definitely very difficult to figure out the right way to incorporate subjective experience in studies. But on the other hand, I find it very important. And yeah, and then for example, in case of the PDR, I think it's crucial to focus on subjective experience. Do you guys have any other question or anything that you were kind of considering or wondering about?
Also, I have wondering. So in this study, there are huge information by the clinical psychology self-report. So yes, of course, self-report not the self-report. So recently, clinical psychology continued to approach by this self-report or interview method. But yes, so the knowledge or I don't have the information by clinical psychologist point. So they use normal. I think in Japan normally use the counseling or interviewing self-report or something, and not the physiological one and the behavior or something. But they also have the reason why they use the self-report is more how to say useful to approach our patients. So yeah, just a comment, but in this after of reading this paper, how think the clinical psychologist? Now I'm wondering.
I think it's, yeah, I think in one way something that might be relevant for clinical psychologists or like in just general people looking at psychiatric disorders is that yeah, like you said, in clinical work it is quite accepted that you use subjective experience as an important, maybe the most important measure of to understand the condition of someone. But then when it comes to medication and when it comes to neuroscience, like scientific research, then we rarely use them. So if there's a discordance between, or if there's if it's like you give some kind of medication, offer some kind of medication to someone, or offer a therapy, like some kind of therapeutic approach that was based on scientific evidence, based on either physiological responses or behavioral responses, they may not have the same impact on subjective experience. And I think it's important to, yeah, to kind of understand and remind ourselves to that, because yeah, it like just because someone reaction times got slower or they were like faster again after a scary stimuli or something like that. Like, so if there was some kind of behavioral change, it doesn't necessarily mean that will easily or quickly translate to the subjective experience of feeling anxious.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, at least this is what I kind of got from the paper.
Yeah, I agree. So it needs to collaborate between clinician and the are the scientific researcher and this biological researcher or something.
Yeah, and I was actually wondering about Rishi, do you know if like have you been interested in because I know that you're very interested in developmental aspects of consciousness and like the developmental perspective, and I wonder whether the subjective experience of children in these cases, yeah, do you think it's easy to incorporate that in research? Because I know that many researchers are kind of hesitant to include children because it's difficult for them, it's difficult to explain things for them or to make sure that they understand. Yeah.
Yeah, I see. Okay, so children's self-report is not correct what we expected, but their self-report is just real for them, children. So children's self-report information or data is so difficult for our developmental psychologists. But yes, so actually, we considered about the children's metacognition ability. So normally children have the yes bias or positivity bias. It means that after a question, regardless of children's thinking, children tend to say yes. So, or something, children, in fact, they didn't know the fact, but do you have a confidence? And the children, yes, I have confidence, but this response is obviously incorrect, but children, yes. So I think one point is that the metacognitive ability is amateur, so children's self-report is difficult to consider the data, but yes, for so so yes, so it's dependent on the study's topic or study theme. So children, so fantasy, imagination or something, children, we are interested in their mental world. So in this situation, the children's self-report is so good. But how about the perception or the metacognition? We cannot use normally children's self-report. Is it your question's answer?
Yeah. So I was actually wondering about this, and yeah, I think you like provided so much good information and context on the fact that like we also know that the prefrontal cortex is still developing up to like a very old age, and I was also wondering about what these the higher order theories think about, or how they kind of what is their take on the developmental aspect. So I will definitely read up on that because I would be curious. I don't know what is the higher order kind of perspective on the development of consciousness.
Yeah, sorry, and I think there's another point that children are word knowledge or concept knowledge. So younger children didn't know the word like the more detailed emotion. something, well, so fear and or scare or something, these so concept is different for children, difficult for children. So categorized by these. So or something, so emotional world is also important for children to examine these or self-reports like the emotional one. So normally we use the like the emotional phase and which one. So how so scare phase and or angry phase or fear phase in the paper, and we ask children which phase is same as your fear or something and choose. But children, because children didn't or didn't say or didn't categorize the emotion by words, fear, scare, angry. It is difficult for children to categorize by words, but children can detect or separate these emotional so principal emotional concept children have, but by labeled by word, it's difficult for children. So self report is also difficult in this situation.
Yeah, and then I guess when you kind of ask children to identify like a facial expression then that is also more of a physiological response, I guess.
Yeah.
No, I think it's been very interesting to consider what this paper would imply, or how would this paper work in the context of developmental psychology.
So regarding your Aniko's point, the developmental perspective, like can we say that, because the children, the brain of children, the prefrontal is still developing, so we can assume that they do not have a proper higher order representation, and then they tend to have more discordance than adults. Or I am sure that we can't present a fear stimulus to children, so it's not possible to test that, but we can test out other emotions like fear, not fear, happiness or something like that, joy or whatever. So it's I think interesting to see whether we can see that kind of differences. The differences between children and adults. And another thing is that it's not related to this paper, but I'm curious whether there is a study on children's and kind of reward when they make a correct response in terms of metacognitions. In that case, if children can, show the same performance as an adult, means that they have just the same metacognitive performance, but they still believe that they could do that task correctly, and then tend to say yes over and over again. Or is there any studies assessing children's metacognitive abilities, or kind of train children to make a correct metacognitive response?
I see. Sorry, I don't know, but yeah. But I think yes, metacognitive performance is different between children and adults, and So learning or motivation is also different from children and adults. So let's say how sorry, difficult. I can't say correctly, but for metacognitive performance, like the positivity bias, if children didn't know, but the children have the high confidence, means that after of the like the failure or something, so children, if the children have the failure and depressed, or their confidence, next children cannot challenge or try the others other one. But if the children's like the positivity bias, children have positivity bias. If children's activity is failure, but children can challenge next step because children didn't depress like low and have no low confidence, but also high confidence. And now I failure, but next I can do this for high confidence or a positive bias. So yes, I think the metacognitive motivation is different also. So immature of the prefrontal cortex also, and metacognitive function also immature, but also I think the motivation of the metacognition also different between children and adults. And after, yeah, sorry, I don't know, but after learning or learning of the metacognitive, yes, like feedback. Sorry, I don't know. Children can, after of the learning, or children can better metacognitive performance. I think for upper the elementary children, like the 7-year-old or more, it also, I think that maybe happen, but under the young 6 year, like the 3 to 6 years young children, I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. And my guess is that if they are too young or they too little, they can't understand the concept of metacognition, or they just can't, understand the concept. So it's a bit difficult to train, probably.
Well, but you would say that, for example, when children learn language, they do learn from feedback from their environment. So then they would have some kind of evaluation of like, okay, but I don't know. But yeah, I guess that's a different example in a way.
Yeah, because if we can train children to make a metacognitively like a correct response, then after that we can, assess their performance without considering or removing the effect of yes tendency. So that was my kind of point.
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
Well, something that, I mean, I don't know if it's actually really reliable, but this is just more like a kind of thing that I have heard other people say or do with their children. Is that like they try to, like when, for example, a child, like they fall down or like they get injured, like usually the parents are like, or some parents say that, oh, well, let's not get scared, because then the child will get scared. And then if you act very calmly, then they don't like, for example, they don't get scared or don't cry. And then in that way, it's like that would be a very like strong case for discordance between physiological like pain or like some kind of response of something happened, and then they just don't have the experience of pain unless they get some kind of social cue or yeah. But I don't know actually if this is actually true, or this is more just like a folk psychology, something like that parents say or do.
Yeah, I don't know whether my comment is relevant to your question, but let's say I don't want to experience anything about fear. So, I mean, if possible, I want to, you know, somehow destroy the higher order representation of fear so that I don't feel anything, fear, only fear. I understand it's, you know, dangerous as well, because if you don't feel fear, then it will hurt your body a lot. But, you know, of course, you know, let's say traumatic experiences, for the treatment of traumatic experiences, such kind of technique has been developed, I guess. But that's a very interesting technology.
Yeah, and I think it would be interesting to look at the neural circuits if we can actually identify very specific neural circuits of only this higher order representation of the subjective experience of fear. Then perhaps you could do some, I don't know, neurofeedback or some other things to try to specifically only modify the subjective experience. But we'll see. Anyhow, I don't have any more questions. Do you guys have anything else? Yeah, because I think we have discussed for like an hour approximately. Yeah, well, thank you. Jota, usually you do the goodbye thing, so you should do
it because you are the host.
No, I feel we have to do that. Please do that. That's how the traditions work.
Okay, then, okay, we're gonna finish our discussion now and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.